If there exists anything mightier than destiny, then it is the courage to face destiny unflinchingly. Geibel 30, June 1941. A summer sultriness blanketed the endless plains of eastern Poland, and only the movement of the train swaying slightly beneath us brought relief from the heat. The heavily laden transport rolled slowly through ragged pine forests and stretches of sandy, uncultivated land, passing tiny farms and villages and crossing meandering rivers as we journeyed eastward. Except for the occasional children who waved from dusty streets and roadsides, the local inhabitants ignored us. The men and women, dressed in drab clothing, became lost in the shimmering heat as the wheels of the Reichsbahn carried us further away. We spent the hours sitting or lying under a cloudless sky on the open flatbed cars, resting between tightly secured weapons and vehicles. Unlike in peacetime, when strict regulations dominated, we were allowed to loosen the first button of our grey-green uniforms and roll back our sleeves for some relief from the sweltering heat. The news of war with Russia was already several days old, and we spoke little of our prospects in the conflict. Everyone was confident that this war, like those against France and Poland, would end quickly. At dawn, the walls and towers of Krakow, the holy city of Poland, where the heart of Pilsudski rests in the cathedral, came into view. The transport screeched to a halt beside a dusty rail-switching station. Within seconds, we were surrounded by dishevelled children, ignored by the stone-faced military police sentries standing nearby. "Bitte Brot, Herr," they cried plaintively, with dirty hands eagerly grasping for the morsels we passed to them from our bread bags. We were permitted to disembark, and the children descended upon us. Poor Poland, I thought, as I handed a slice of bread to a young girl in exchange for a tattered newspaper. Printed the previous day in both German and Polish, it contained the first reports about the Eastern Campaign, the advance on Lemberg. Gridnov, Brest-Litovsk, Wilnow, Kovno and Dunneburg had already fallen into German hands. Ecstatic headlines boasted that over 2,582 Soviet aircraft and 1,297 Soviet tanks had been destroyed. Soviet-occupied Poland was being freed from the Bolshevik yoke. The military police soon sprang into action, blowing whistles and shouting orders for us to reboard. We climbed back onto the train, which groaned under its weight before slowly resuming its journey. As we moved forward, I read the newspaper aloud to my gun crew, who lay listlessly on the flat rail car, uninterested. I glanced back at the rail platform, now occupied only by the ragged band of children, as we continued on toward an unknown destiny. On the 1st of July, we came to a stop 10 kilometres west of Pelkini, near Yaroslav, where we dismounted and marched eastward. The infantry formed a long column on foot, the unenviable fate of every infantryman. Our anti-tank gun was pulled ahead by a chenillette-tracked vehicle captured during the French campaign. Soon the smell of smoke and ashes filled the air, and we saw large craters and scorched vehicles, evidence of the handiwork of German Stuka dive bombers. We eventually halted at a roadside canteen, where Swabian Red Cross nurses, under the watchful eyes of military police, served us cold coffee from a horse-drawn field kitchen. In vain they asked for news from home. We continued eastward in a long grey column, leaving the nurses behind. As dusk fell, we parked our vehicles and guns beneath a sparse row of trees lining the narrow road. Camouflage was ordered to protect us from enemy aircraft, and we did our best to cover our position with thin branches. At dawn, supply columns overtook us, rolling toward the distant sunrise. After another day of following their tracks, we encountered the enemy for the first time late in the afternoon. The road was lined with endless columns of Russian prisoners in ragged khaki-brown uniforms, marching in the opposite direction. Some, without caps, wore wisps of straw or rags tied to their heads to protect them from the burning sun. A few were barefoot or half-dressed, a sign of how quickly our forces had overrun their positions. Their strange mix of clothing and features revealed their diverse origins. White Russians, dark-skinned Caucasians, Kyrgyzes, Uzbeks, nomads with Mongolian traits, a multitude from the vast lands of Soviet Russia. They passed us silently, eyes downcast. Occasionally, a group supported a wounded or exhausted comrade. In school, we were taught that the Urals divided Europe from Asia. Yet here, in what we thought was the heart of Europe, we saw Asia. The long column of misery disappeared behind us as darkness fell, and we halted for the night. Beneath a starry sky, we wrapped ourselves in camouflage-printed shelter quarters and did not awaken until dawn. The 14th Panzer Jager Company was the forward advance unit, and at 0500 we marched. The crumbling ruins of burned-out houses stood as mute witnesses to the fighting Yaroslav had experienced during the Poland campaign, a mere 2 years ago, but seemingly a lifetime away. After crossing the San River at Radimo, we stood on Russian soil. We passed a large German cemetery from World War I, its faded wooden sign bearing the inscription, "To the memory of those comrades who fell at Dubrovica." Our column wasn't permitted to stop long enough to examine the graves. Little did we realize how many more cemeteries of our own would line the roads deep into Russia. Soon we encountered fresh mounds of earth, marked by rough birch crosses topped with the unmistakable steel helmets of the German Wehrmacht. These first silent, bloody witnesses on the highway to the east were arranged in regulation rows and columns. We attempted to divert our gaze, but were always drawn back to the graves. We marched on without speaking, and the silent red-brown mounds of earth seemed to beckon to us, as if to say, "Do not leave us here, do not abandon us in this strange place." Faint artillery fire could be heard from the direction of Lemberg. The condition of the roads became steadily worse, and dust settled thickly on the lancers, horses, and vehicles. Only the dim silhouette of the vehicle ahead of our platoon was visible as the sun stood like an orange globe in its zenith, barely penetrating the choking clouds of dust. Sweat and dirt combined to create bizarre shapes on the faces peering from beneath the heavy green helmets. Near Krakowice, we again combined shelter quarters to tent and spent the night. Our odyssey into the void continued as we advanced toward an unknown destination. We encountered primitive villages lining the road, and Russian women and children peered at us intently from the shadows of doorways, gazing at us through the protection of rough-hewn window panes. The only men to be seen were ancient veterans of other wars. When asked, the people of the villages would tell us of the Bolsheviki. The menace and terror of the Siberian penal camps could be seen in the eyes of these people as they spoke, and they told us that pictures of Christ and Stalin hung in the schools. When the village teachers asked, "Whom do you thank for your daily bread?" the children would be compelled to answer, "Stalin." We were relieved to be experiencing firsthand the effects of communism, confirming that what we were hearing could not simply be attributed to our own propaganda. Niedermeyer remarked, "After having seen Russia, we now know how fortunate we are to be German." On July 5th, we moved through Lemberg. The city had been heavily hit twice during the initial course of the war, and the early morning haze revealed burned-out factories, ruined homes, and destroyed tanks with greasy black smoke billowing from their still-hot carcasses. In one of the few partially intact sectors of the city, a long line of people waited in front of a bread depot. They stared at us with listless eyes as we passed. The Russian airbase at Lemberg had been rendered unusable by the Stukas. Blackened aircraft and smashed equipment were scattered throughout the area, and during a pause in our march, soldiers wandered among the wreckage, photographing one another alongside destroyed Soviet planes, and curiously picking through the ruins, ever mindful of strict regulations against looting or non-authorized requisition of captured enemy equipment. With the war against the Soviet Union only a few days underway, we still observed anything associated with the Soviet Army with curiosity. Our march continued through the first half of July. For days, great numbers of destroyed Russian tanks lined our path, and capsized prime movers with limbered field guns were scattered along the roadsides. In the fields, numerous abandoned Russian artillery positions appeared intact, indicating how quickly our offensive had overtaken the Soviet defenders. We were astonished at how well motorized the Soviet army was, as our own artillery was represented primarily by horse-drawn equipment reminiscent of World War I. The graves of German and Russian soldiers were now found close together, the German graves marked with rough-hewn wooden crosses to the right of the road, the Russians to the left. The Russian graves remained nameless, marked only with rifles and bayonets stuck into the fresh earth. The German graves were topped with the customary steel helmet, and from some of the crosses hung identification discs from linen strings, waiting to be collected and filed. On July 8th, as we neared Brody on the wide, rutted road, we passed supply units and cable layers of the 71st Division of the 6th Army. The cable layers advised us that the division had taken Lemberg with 600 casualties, and confidently reported that the war was to end within several weeks. Our advance halted at the old Russian-Galician border. We expected to encounter strong enemy opposition when the 6th and 17th Armies reached the Stalin Line, a series of bunkers and heavily defended strong points. We were disappointed to learn that the 132nd Infantry Division had been assigned to remain in reserve, as most of us were eager to see action before the inevitable surrender of the Soviet Union. 14 July passed without notice. Our existence remained marked by boredom. Our environment consisted of 100-metre-wide transport roads, dust, mud, burning heat, thunderstorms, and endless open space, with only occasional clusters of sparse trees stretching to the horizon. Thatched-roofed huts of the collective farms could be seen in the distance, and we concentrated on them, like palms in the desert, to guide us to primitive wells. We had received word that the wells were often poisoned by the Red Army in retreat. Skeletal remains of horses left a lingering stench along our path, a smell that would forever remind us of the Soviet paradise into which we found ourselves marching ever deeper. The advance slowed as we crossed through Jampol. Occasionally we were lucky enough to obtain a few onions and carrots from the villages that lined our path. More rarely, a chicken or a couple of eggs served to augment the monotonous field rations. We reflected with longing on our time spent in Kärnten and Zagreb before the onslaught against the Russians began, as there we had enjoyed cold beer and slibovitz. The infantry continued to march from sunrise to sunset. Dusty, sweaty, and clammy without relief from the brutal climate, we penetrated deeper into Soviet Russia. Although it was against regulations, small pannier carts, pulled by stout Russian ponies, were requisitioned to lighten the load of our field packs. As we left civilization farther behind us, this habit became more commonplace. The sparse human habitation was primitive and probably lice-ridden, so nights were spent in tents, haystacks, or more often on the bare earth, sleeping rolled in the ever-useful shelter quarter that each Lancer was issued. Members of horse-drawn units would be awakened at dawn by the nuzzling of hungry and thirsty horses. We passed wood-framed schoolhouses, which were little more than rough halls decorated with the characteristic red stars and red-painted podiums for political gatherings of the Communist Party. Tattered, dusty pictures of Stalin and Lenin hung on the walls. Stalin had introduced compulsory schooling, where previously, during the era of the Tsar, the alphabet was hardly known. We were surprised that many of the schoolchildren could speak some broken German, and from captured propaganda material, we learned that political education was a priority for the children. On July 17th, we received mail from home for the first time since our advance began, and 10 days later, the division entered the Ukraine, marching southeast over Kasatin toward Rushin. The Ukraine steamed in the summer heat. Over wide, sandy roads and on pavement of rough stones, we entered a land of unending horizons. Endless wide steppes, grain and sunflower fields bordered our way eastward. Primitive wooden windmills dotted the horizon, and we used them as drink and rest stations during the lonely march through a land that left us with unforgettable impressions of freedom, contrasting with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. We came to a halt in an unkempt acacia grove that offered sparse shade in an ocean of grass. The company had marched 60 kilometres in less than 24 hours on painfully torn and bruised feet. Dusty and channeled with streaks of sweat, faces browned by wind and sun peered from under heavy helmets to observe our domain. hands slippery with sweat, gripped the entrenching tools to tear holes in the earth. The command was given, "Dig in!" Stripped to the waist, we hacked at the earth without speaking, and nearby the singing of bees reminded me of their own endless toil. Clemens and Gare, the two tractor drivers, decided to locate the source of the bees in search of honey. Equipped with mess tins and armed with shelter quarters and gas masks as protection from bee stings, they disappeared behind the gun position into a collective farm. After an hour of labour, I had constructed, to the left of the pack position, a regulation earthwork with the high side facing our front, on which we would lay our rifles and grenades. The anti-tank gun stood well concealed with branches and grass near the edge of the grove. A sandy road cut through the open field before us in an east-west direction, and in the shimmering heat of the afternoon sun, the silhouettes of huts in a distant village were visible on the horizon. To the left of the road, Gefreiter Powell had placed his half-track to the rear of the position, hidden behind the acacia grove, and he set to work camouflaging his pack. Forward observers from the artillery and the mortar units moved ahead to their observation points with rolls of communication cable strapped to their backs. Only the occasional clatter of an entrenching tool, canteen cup or mess tin, broke the stillness of a seemingly peaceful world. Folding my dusty tunic under my head for a pillow, I had just begun to doze in the afternoon sun when a rifle shot broke the silence. In one motion, I rolled into the freshly dug foxhole, clapped on my heavy steel helmet, and brought my carbine to my shoulder. Staring forward, I could detect only emptiness and softly swaying grasses. During infantry defence drills, it had been hammered into us to shoot at every disturbance, every moving leaf and blade of grass. In order to kill the enemy. Now, with my heart pounding, thoughts raced through my mind. Would today be the day I must kill another human being? Who shoots first? Who hits first, him or me? Must I kill today to save my own life and the lives of my comrades? I pictured the rows of graves we had passed during our march, with carefully placed crosses and identification markers hanging from them, and tried to shake them from my mind. About 600 metres to the left of our position, the sound of rifle fire broke the stillness. At first it sounded like the familiar popping of carbine fire at the training range, but soon wild shots snapped through the air and ricocheted above us. With burning eyes we continued staring forward, but we noticed nothing unusual before our position. Through the rifle fire, the distinctive crack of an anti-tank gun sounded far in the distance. Within a few minutes the incident was over. Dust and the acrid smell of burnt cordite drifted faintly in the air, and to our left an ugly black cloud billowed into the blue afternoon sky. We remained crouched in our positions. In hushed tones, and with hearts pounding with excitement, we tried to assess what had occurred. A short time later, we learned through a courier that Powell's anti-tank gun had knocked out a Soviet armoured reconnaissance vehicle, and that an attack by a Russian rifle company had been repulsed. Little did we realize that, in the months and years ahead, this short encounter would come to be considered nothing more than a casual and insignificant brush with the enemy. This first action of the regiment was little indication of the nightmarish years of fighting, marked by deprivation, sorrow, and countless victims that lay before us. From this vast expanse, many of us would never return, but at the time one didn't dwell on such thoughts. I turned to my diary, a small pocket-sized book bound in black oilcloth, its corners already ragged and the pages stained with sweat and rain to recount the incident. The two drivers returned with mess tins dripping with honey, a satisfying addition to our evening rations. We ate the honey with komis bread, welcoming the change from the usual tinned liver and blood sausage, washing it down with cold tea before preparing for another march at dawn. On the 30th of July, we found ourselves in bivouac at Mikhailovka. Over the previous days, some of the units had experienced attacks from Soviet bomber and fighter-bomber squadrons, though they had proven ineffective in slowing our advance. The rifle companies and horse-drawn units marched throughout the night, covering about 65 kilometres to reach Kargalik on the 31st of July. That night the password was issued, and rumours circulated of a pending attack to take place the following morning at 0700 along a wide front. We passed the summer night wrapped in shelter quarters, crouching in our grass-lined foxholes. The rumours held true, as exactly at 0700 on the 1st of August, we began our push forward toward the Soviet defences near Mirovka. An immense open field lay before us, with little protection save for gently rolling terrain and shallow depressions invisible to the untrained eye. This was a great advantage for the Soviets, as they had dug into the safety of the earth with a clear field of fire before their defences. We made our final preparations to abandon our positions and move across the open steppe. With little effort, we brought the pack into position on the edge of a wheat field, which offered a wide field of fire facing eastward over a green sea of wheat, interrupted only by sparse potato gardens. The first rays of the morning sun danced across the wheat stalks of Ukraine, and through the morning haze we could make out the distant silhouettes of two villages on the horizon. We sat on the gun carriage drinking warm coffee, attempting to dispel the cold feeling within us. Everyone tried to appear nonchalant, speaking of things unrelated to the war, hoping through conversation to conceal the anxiety etched in our sunburned faces. Company officers gathered in tight circles several dozen metres away, speaking in low tones and glancing toward enemy positions, occasionally raising field glasses to their eyes. At 0650, our artillery opened fire. Heavy projectiles screamed overhead, destined for predetermined targets within enemy positions. The infantry, burdened with weapons, ammunition, communications equipment and explosives, advanced along a broad front. Movements followed as planned, giving the impression of nothing more than another training exercise at Pfarrkirchen or Dugoselo. A captured French tractor clattered noisily to our position. Limbering our gun, we climbed aboard and advanced, leaving a rising cloud of dust in our wake. We passed an armoured reconnaissance vehicle knocked out by Poel the previous day, our eyes drawn to the macabre scene of a half-burned corpse hanging with a naked torso from one of the hatches. The two anti-tank guns of the platoon lurched forward over the undulating ground, advancing along the sandy road toward Kargalik. Machine guns from the foremost infantry units were already engaged, the audible bursts of MG-34S drifting back to us over the wheat stalks. Behind us, mortar tubes and artillery pieces pounded with dull thumps, contrasting with the high-pitched bursts of small arms fire. Suddenly, ricochets whistled and bounced among us, sending us scrambling for cover in the ruts and furrows of the road. "Take cover!" screamed Gun Captain Hartmann. His arms motioned wildly, his lips moving though his words were drowned out by the pounding thunder of weaponry. Finally, the moment had come. It was our time to face the enemy. Despite the gnawing fear within us, we felt profound relief, demonstrating how our priorities had shifted since the march began. The gun crews automatically and mechanically set to work, as they had done countless times before. The gunners loosened the limbers, locked the wheels, spread the limbers wide, adjusted for range, and loaded the first round into the open breech of the barrel. Hartmann knelt next to the gun, binoculars held to his eyes, and directed the aimer in textbook fashion. "Right end of the hedgerow, range 400, machine gun nest, fire!" One round after another left the barrel in response to his commands. We could see an infantry platoon from the 5th Company pinned in a shallow depression under heavy fire from enemy machine guns. Under cover of our fire, the platoon slowly advanced. Thin wisps of smoke revealed where dry wheat stalks had been ignited by tracer fire. The collective farm at Klein Kargalik, reportedly occupied by Soviet artillery observers, was taken under fire by our second park from 600 metres. Straw-thatched huts began to burn, thick black smoke rising into the clear sky. We received the command to shift positions, advancing toward the crossroads near the burning farm huts. Through the bursts of mortar rounds and machine gun fire, we cheered as we saw the Russians abandoning their positions. As they fled, our machine gunners opened fire with MG-34S, sending streams of copper-jacketed rounds into the retreating figures. To our right, prisoners appeared, hands raised and wide-eyed with fear, stripped of helmets and combat equipment. They instinctively trotted toward our rear with hands clasped behind their heads. As we changed positions, our tracked vehicle broke a tread, spinning in a half-circle before stopping, helplessly stuck in the open. Despite the danger, the drivers managed to repair it, and we hitched the gun to the tractor once again. Amid enemy fire and heavy artillery, we strained against the harnesses to pull the gun. Exhausted and sun-beaten, we pushed forward across the Ukrainian steppe, with the enemy never far behind. As we moved forward, we came under sporadic rifle fire from a group of Soviets who later surrendered, moving toward us with upraised arms, fear and exhaustion clearly etched in their faces. The day's objective, a railway embankment in front of the village, had been reached. 12 kilometres of territory were won in 6 hours of difficult fighting, and my thoughts dwelled on the insignificance of 12 kilometres. 12 kilometres in an endless land, where unbroken fields stretched to the horizon before us from sunrise to sunset. I wondered how many more 12-kilometre battles lay ahead of us during our march away from the setting sun. We came upon one of our casualties lying motionless in the dirt on the road, his helmet still secured tightly to his head, sightless eyes staring into the sky. Russian prisoners were quickly employed to carry the wounded to a field dressing station. Escorted by our lightly wounded who marched along the edge of the road, the pitiful column wound toward the 2nd Battalion collection point to our rear. Thus, the regiment experienced its first clash with the enemy, and we had suffered our first losses as well. With no joy of victory in our ranks, the feeling of excitement quickly drained away, replaced by an overwhelming sadness and longing to leave this place. As yet, we had not experienced the true effects of prolonged warfare, which becomes an environment that sets aside all former bonds to family and culture, irretrievably replacing them with bonds to the comrade at your side. That was to come in the weeks, months, and years ahead. The journalists assigned to the propaganda company would write colourful reports on what had taken place, and would also add that the dead and wounded had done their duty in service to the Führer and the fatherland. Our gun crew was assigned to perform a security detail, and as dusk fell, we positioned the gun along the road near the battalion defence line. The isolated bursts of impacting mortar rounds echoed over the wheat fields and seemed to chase the sun as it sank slowly in the west toward Germany. Our thoughts followed the sinking, fiery ball penetrating the evening haze to the horizon, and we thought of our homeland whose borders lay 1,500 kilometres behind us. The front refused to sleep at night. Reconnaissance units from both opposing forces remained on the move, slipping through the darkness to locate the enemy positions. Again and again, the Russian Maxim fire broke forth through the darkness, always answered by the ripping sound of our Spandau MG-34S, quickly joined by erratic rifle fire. The occasional detonation of hand grenades and the sharp reports of submachine guns drifted across the fields, and for long moments the defensive lines would be illuminated by glowing flares arcing skyward to hang, sizzling, above the line. In the early morning hours, we were withdrawn from the sector and deployed 2 kilometres to the south in preparation for another attack. 2 August was marked by a break in the monotonous field rations when we boiled freshly dug potatoes in an unnamed Ukrainian village. Oberschütze Fair had already plucked a chicken, and together with the boiled hen and potatoes, we ate peeled cucumbers. Several hundred metres along the approach to the village on a small rise was Unteroffizier Eigner's burned-out half-track. During the previous day's fighting, he had driven directly into a well-concealed minefield where the 3 men of the gun crew met their deaths. 2 of the crew members were killed instantly. The anti-tank mine had severed both of Eigner's legs, and he had died that night at the medical collecting point. Their helmets could be seen clustered beneath a birch cross near the destroyed half-track. Their graves added to the mounting casualties the war in the Soviet Union was costing the German army. Not far from their rough gravesite was a row of several dozen wooden box mines dug up by the engineers. The soldiers had long since found an appropriate name for the deadly little boxes, referring to them as Kindersärge. Word passed through the ranks of the infantrymen of how the division chaplain, Satzke, had risked his life to recover some of the men who fell wounded before the enemy during the previous day's fighting. We remained ever conscious of how the wounded were treated, as we lived every moment with the reality that we, too, could join them at any time without warning. Many of the soldiers who had not previously been so inclined began to attend religious services, and with the growing consciousness of our own mortality, we became more aware of the presence of the chaplain. As our casualties continued to mount, the chaplain, who wore no insignia of rank in the German army, came to play a more significant role in our lives. For far too many, he would offer the last voice of reassurance and the last vestige of comfort before they, too, succumbed to mortal wounds. Our lines of supply became more strained with each day's advance, and as our momentum slowed to a crawl, we continued to experience ever-increasing sporadic shelling. Once my gas mask and entrenching tool were ripped away by a shell splinter, and my tunic was torn as well, but other than a bruise on my hip, I escaped injury. The Russian rearguard elements continued to withdraw before us, attempting to burn many of the few mud and straw huts in our path, and always leaving an ever-present cadre of snipers, who slowly extracted a deadly price from our ranks at the cost of their own lives. On the 3rd of August, we spent most of the night lying in the middle of a turnip field. At length, a reconnaissance platoon determined that a still intact collective farm, some 500 metres distant, was free of enemy troops, and in the early pre-dawn hours we advanced to the tiny collection of huts. The company kitchen sent forward hot coffee and schmaltzbrot. Our gun crew claimed one of the small thatched roof huts, and we piled straw onto the mud floor and dozed for several hours, thankful that we were not still lying somewhere in the darkness among the turnips. The following day, we advanced farther toward the east until our forward reconnaissance units reported having reached the wide Dnieper River. The immense bulk of the Soviet army seemed to have evaporated, and victory appeared all but certain as we neared the banks of the Dnieper. For weeks our routine had consisted of endless marching, interrupted only by sporadic resistance from small bands of Soviet stragglers overtaken by our advanced units. The occasional enemy dead now attracted little attention, and prisoners became a common sight, always rising from the terrain to approach us cautiously with upraised arms. Most often they would be simply disarmed and motioned toward the rear, often unescorted, to be collected by the reserve column. The evening of the 5th of August found us in recently constructed defensive positions before Velikaya Pritsky. The ominous thunder of heavy shelling continued without pause as our artillery pounded the enemy beyond the horizon. We waited nervously throughout the night for our offensive, which was to begin the next morning. Our attack was launched at precisely 0550 with the Dnieper as the objective. Our artillery batteries fired smoke and high explosives onto a commanding height designated Hill 197, and from our position we could observe many of the enemy troops fleeing through the clouds of smoke enveloping the terrain features. Prisoners later stated that many of the Soviet troops had fled, panic-stricken, out of fear that we had used poison gas against their stronghold, and indeed sightings of enemy troops donning gas masks during the attack had been reported. Within hours, the ridge was captured by the infantry with minimal losses. At 0850, the enemy fought a deadly delaying action back to Hill 160, from where they continued to offer dogged resistance from carefully prepared positions. Interrogations of exhausted prisoners indicated that the heavy concentrations of artillery fire were instrumental in draining the will of the defenders. In the late afternoon, our own forces came under attack from squadrons of fighter bombers who inflicted little damage. On the morning of the 7th of August, we laboured to dig defensive positions into the earth near a village called Balika, about 100 metres from the Dnieper. From our position, the wide Dnieper was visible, and we engaged in burrowing into the earth as quickly as possible in anticipation of fighter bomber. In this sector, we found ourselves facing an enemy who held superiority in heavy weapons, and our own artillery units were now compelled to ration ammunition because of our strained supply lines. The depth of our penetration into the Soviet Union began to take its toll, and ammunition rationing served as a first indication of the shortages that we were to encounter with disastrous results in future battles. The distant thunder of far-off heavy guns resounded faintly in our ears, and was quickly followed by the roar of impacting projectiles echoing over the open terrain. The evening brought more attacks from the Ratters flying low over our positions, passing over us in what appeared to be no pattern of attack. We attempted to repel them with rifles and light machine guns, with little effect. One evening, I observed 2 rations carriers from the artillery battery located behind us, moving along the lower part of the ridge toward the front. The soldier in the lead carried the cylindrical thermos canister in a harness on his back, and they picked their way through the broken ground in the growing twilight, plodding slowly forward over undulating terrain torn by artillery shells and made soft and muddy from the intermittent thunderstorms. Suddenly, we were forced once again to dive for cover as a Rata began a surprise descent upon us from a low-hanging cloud bank, and the 2 oncoming figures scrambled for shelter behind the wall of one of the mud huts at the edge of the village. The plane loosed a burst of fire into the village as it passed overhead, before disappearing into the grey thunderheads as quickly as it had appeared. Moments later, the 2 men could again be seen making their way past our position. They picked their way through the morass with difficulty, one following closely behind the other, curses clearly audible in the still air. The second man had slung his carbine and was holding both free hands against the sides of the canister in an attempt to salvage the remaining portion of their day's rations. The steel container had been cleanly punctured by a round from the aircraft's board gun, and the projectile had gone through the sides of the canister, leaving the hot contents pouring in twin streams onto the ground. Dodging the shell craters in the evening twilight, they wound their way through the muddy and torn earth toward the waiting men in the battery position. Still swearing and cursing the Ratas and Ivan, they stumbled slowly forward toward their destination. The soup for the artillery battery was to be carefully rationed that night, but however sparse the quantity, it would still be preferred over the monotonous iron rations of wurst and hard bread we were often compelled to consume while on the march. On the evening of the 9th of August, we were treated to Schweinebraten, brought forward from the field kitchen by couriers, and the following morning we deployed forward again. The enemy had attempted to push armoured units through a sector held by a neighbouring division, and elements of the 68th and our 132 Days Infantry Division were ordered to reinforce the sector. The march was ordered for 0800. In preparation for the move, we were provided with coffee and schmaltzbrot. Despite the sickening odour of a dead horse that permeated the air from the edge of the road, we enjoyed the first meal since being treated to Schweinebraten early in the evening of the previous day. During our short pause, a band of Stukas flew over us, and we were able to observe them break from their formation and dive like hawks on unseen prey. The screaming aircraft sirens threw panic and confusion throughout the enemy ranks as the Stukas dropped their bombs into the columns of Russian tanks and troop concentrations hidden from our view behind the terrain features. Clouds of black smoke mushroomed skyward through the still air, marking the locations of the vehicles that had fallen victim to the dive bombers. The Russians soon retaliated with air attacks of their own. Not having had time to prepare defensive positions, we dove for cover in the shallow depressions in the ground, only to be bypassed by the enemy aircraft. Behind us, some bombs fell near a medical collection point without causing casualties. On the 12th of August, our pilots dropped artillery ammunition to the batteries in our rear area. The artillery units had fired ceaselessly while repelling the heavy Soviet counterattacks during the previous days, and the air observers reported that the Soviets were pulling their forces back toward the east over the Dnieper near Kanev. Our own units continued to press attacks, but enemy resistance had stiffened, and we gained little ground. My gun was situated near a railway embankment to secure the rail lines running toward Kanev and over the Dnieper. The front in our sector had remained quiet throughout the afternoon, and Hartmann and I set out on a short reconnaissance of our area. Behind the rail line in an easterly direction, along the edge of a small grove of trees, we suddenly found ourselves staring into the muzzle of a Maxim machine gun not 10 metres distant. Concealed beneath the shadows of low-lying branches, a blood-soaked figure in a khaki uniform was draped motionless over the gun carriage, as if resting. Quietly releasing the safety catches of our submachine guns, we gingerly edged forward, surveying the scene before us. Lying closely together in a jagged row along the railway embankment, we found a group of about 30 dead Russians. From their position, it was obvious that during the previous day's fighting, a burst from a tank or aircraft machine gun had caught the platoon in flanking fire, killing or wounding all of them instantly. I slowly slipped forward to examine one of the casualties, and observed that the lifeless hand of one of the corpses still grasped an open package containing a field bandage. The badly wounded Russian had vainly attempted to bandage himself, but, unable to staunch the flow of blood, had slowly died where he lay. His tunic was unbuttoned to the waist, his uniform black with the encrusted blood from a fatal wound. My gaze wandered from the first figure and fell upon a corpse wearing the uniform of a sergeant. The NCO was grasping one of the wheels of the Maxim carriage, his sightless eyes peering forward at the ammunition belt where it fed into the chamber of the weapon. Another held his rifle clenched in cold fists, his head resting against the ground as if asleep, the olive-coloured helmet secured tightly under his chin. Hartmann slipped past me and slowly approached two other figures lying closely together, side by side. One of the figures had draped an arm across the other in a last embrace, as if attempting to comfort a dying comrade. As Hartmann neared, a cloud of flies rose in protest, breaking the deathly silence, and I moved forward to join him in surveying the ghastly scene. Moving silently among the carnage, Hartmann suddenly turned and slipped past me without speaking, heading in the direction from which we had come. Carefully avoiding the eyes of the dead, I quickly followed him. In this abode of death, only the trees, still and quiet, appeared to be survivors and witnesses to the struggle that had occurred, hidden within this wooded glade. Despite having observed death many times over the past months, I unknowingly remained a novice as yet to the true brutality and horror of war. I could never at the time have imagined that in the months and years to come I would become benumbed to death on the battlefield, and that such scenes would be commonplace to us all. In the months to come, our reaction to the deaths we had witnessed would become callous and accepting. We would have searched the corpses for documents, collected weapons, and gathered equipment for our own use. At this early stage during our baptism of war, we remained burdened by the naive thoughts of pity for the dead, and by our own aversion to physical contact with the bloody and torn bodies strewn upon the earth where they had fallen. On the 13th of August, we occupied a former Russian field position approximately 10 kilometers northwest of the city of Kanev on the Dnieper. We had taken over the holes hacked into the clay by the enemy, who had occupied the heights only a few days previously. Experts at digging and camouflaging positions in the open fields, the Russians had constructed earthworks that consisted of circular holes about waist deep, widened at the bottom to allow one to lie comfortably with enough room to stretch the legs. The clay held fast and was excellent for tunnelling, so I confidently improved my position with my entrenching tool. Prior to our attack, a rather small Russian must have occupied it. I found the cool earth of my new dwelling comfortable, despite the sultriness of the hot Ukrainian summer day. Here I felt secure, with the sense that nothing could happen to me quickly or without warning. We crept cautiously forward into the open terrain to gather grass and straw, with which we camouflaged our anti-tank gun. In the evening twilight, someone brought in a large bundle of straw, which was divided among the gun crews. With this, we could plan on spending a comfortable night, providing that Ivan did not wake us. The evening shadows disappeared as twilight turned to darkness, leaving rugged silhouettes of the uneven hills and deep ravines, the Balkas, to the east of us across the Dnieper. We would come to know them well in the future fighting. The enemy had re-established defensive positions approximately 300 meters from our location in a small wood, as well as for protection from Soviet gunboats on the river. Within hours, heavy mortar rounds fired from boats maneuvering on the Dnieper began to impact on the slopes near us. A gun from the 1st Platoon attempted to take one of the boats under fire without success, and our positions along the riverbank soon were blanketed with enemy mortar and artillery fire. Despite our extensive preparations, we were forced to withdraw from the positions to avoid suffering casualties inflicted by an enemy beyond our reach. To the left began a small valley lined with birch trees and heavy undergrowth that would have left an impression of peaceful solitude if not for the occasional Maxim bursts that broke forth to harass our positions from this direction. We left one man on guard, huddled behind the heavy armor shield of the pack for protection from stray machine gun and sniper rounds. The sentry was relieved hourly while we spent the night within our straw-lined holes. It is the nature of war to strike unexpectedly. A soldier may be temporarily lulled into a rare moment of false security, huddled in a crude shelter next to a warming fire during a cold night, or sleeping soundly while curled up in a foxhole, only to be immediately thrust into an unforgiving and violent situation. Once again, we were aroused from our rest by two ration carriers who appeared from the darkness, bringing the unwelcome news that we were again to shift positions and make preparations for another attack in the morning. With the now familiar coldness lying in the depths of our stomachs, we departed our comfortable foxholes shortly before midnight, and were soon labouring under a star-filled sky to complete new positions farther to the right before daybreak. The occasional muffled clanging of entrenching tools was clearly audible to the enemy as we worked, and flares sizzled skyward through the night from the edge of a nearby wood. Time and again it was necessary to throw ourselves flat on the ground and lie motionless to protect ourselves from the Maxim fire probing our positions, the bullets popping through the air overhead and tracers leaving orange-red streaks arching and bouncing through the darkness. During the early morning hours, we received reinforcements in the form of two self-propelled guns, which rumbled up to our position on heavy tracks. Our initial concerns were that their throbbing Maybach engines would attract unwanted attention to our position. Despite our fears, their presence failed to attract more machine gun fire, as the Russians were probably unwilling to reveal their locations to the armoured vehicles. Our attack took place at 1500 on the 14th of August. Following a 10-minute mortar barrage on the woods, the forward assault elements had closed in to within 100 metres from the tree line when a Russian tank concealed on our left flank opened fire. It was spotted by one of the supporting self-propelled guns, and following a brief exchange of fire, the Russian tank was left burning. Our heavy machine guns and mortars opened fire on the tree line in attempts to eliminate the ever-present enemy snipers, and we joined them in firing anti-personnel rounds into the treetops with our pack. With the destruction of the enemy tank, our attack pushed farther forward through the wooded area, and despite our concern the previous evening, it was now comforting to have the support of the heavy assault guns. We were able to determine the location of the destroyed tank from the black cloud of smoke rising from the burning turret, and we heard rumours that one of the companies had suffered a number of casualties from the heavily armoured vehicle before it had been located and destroyed. We were facing the last obstacle defending Kanev. Although we had reached our assigned objective, we were again ordered forward after receiving reinforcements. Our assault resumed at 1800. Our limbered gun was bouncing behind the tractor toward the city, following in the wake of the infantry assault company, when we suddenly came under flanking fire from an enemy field position. Having lain hidden to be bypassed by our advanced elements, the enemy now attacked the platoon with small arms fire that impacted against the thin skin of the tractor and snapped through the air above us. At that moment, the Chenilette motor stalled, and the vehicle lurched to a halt under a hail of fire. With pounding hearts, we grasped submachine guns and carbines and desperately scrambled for cover, the realization that we were caught on open ground gripping us with fear. Our machine gunner Robert, with whom I had served since recruit training, seized his MG-34 and sprang to his feet to lunge forward under the weight of the machine gun. He sprinted toward the muzzle flashes revealing the enemy position, firing streams of bullets from the hip as he ran. Completely surprised by this assault, a number of the Russians rose from their positions and stumbled toward us, arms raised in surrender. We were able to catch a further glimpse of Robert before he disappeared into the undulating terrain, firing bursts into knots of Soviets who continued to offer resistance. We rapidly unlimbered the puck and prepared the gun for action. However, no longer knowing Robert's position, we were forced to hold our fire. With submachine guns and rifles at the ready, we advanced to a small rise, and at the crest we found Robert lying over his MG with a single bullet wound through the heart. The bullet had exited through his back, and from this wound ran a crimson stream of blood. Hartmann knelt alongside the inert form and confirmed that he was dead, rolling him carefully onto his back. Reaching for the linen string from which hung every soldier's identity tag, Hartmann broke the metal tag in two at the perforation before unbuttoning Robert's tunic to remove his identity book and watch. We gazed into questioning eyes staring skyward in the dusk, and the shock on his face seemed to ask, "Why must I die now? Why?" Darkness descended on us as we carried the body back to our position. The experiences of the past weeks now seemed to consume my thoughts, and I pictured the graves left by the roadsides behind us. For the first time in my memory as an adult, I wept at the loss of an especially close friend. The following day, the company commander wrote letters to the relatives of 5 men who had fallen during our most recent encounters with the Soviet Army. On the 17th of August, shallow caves dug into a balka offered us protection from the fighter-bomber attacks. We had reached the heights of the west bank of the Dnieper, and now we found ourselves under erratic shell fire from Soviet artillery positions concealed on the east bank of the river. To the southeast of us was the city of Kanev, and a railway bridge led toward the east over the river. With the capture of this line, we had seized the last avenue of overland retreat for the Russians who had been attempting to withdraw farther east during the previous night. In the early morning hours, isolated groups of enemy soldiers set out in boats to attempt an escape. Sporadic small arms fire could be heard throughout the night as fleeing Russians came under fire from probing reconnaissance units. Immense quantities of equipment and vehicles, including many American Ford trucks, had fallen into our hands. Hidden near the Balka, we found 2 abandoned but completely intact T-34 tanks that were battle-ready with fully loaded ammunition racks. We climbed into the tanks in a vain search for anything of use to us. For several days I had been plagued with acute diarrhea, and I soon found myself incapacitated with a blinding headache accompanied by dizziness and severe stomach cramps. I soon developed a fever, and assisted by some of the lightly wounded, I was ordered to the medical aid station in the rear. En route, we passed through the battlefield of the previous day, and the small depressions lined with bushes and birch trees appeared peaceful to our burning eyes, showing little evidence of the traumatic events that had occurred there. With the exception of isolated bomb craters and occasional scars from shell splinters, little trace of the war that had consumed this land was visible. At the foot of an extended slope, we passed 3 rough-hewn birch crosses garnished with bits of greenery and wildflowers. Under the surface of the freshly turned soil rested my good friend Robert, wrapped in a shelter quarter, sharing a ragged birch cross with his fallen comrades, his battered grey-green helmet perched on the cross to mark his place among the dead. My thoughts quickly left the graves as the painful throbbing behind my eyes increased, and in a feverish delirium we stumbled through our advanced positions abandoned 3 days ago. The burned-out tank provided us with a good reference point. Approximately 100 meters farther, we encountered a staggering figure with swinging arms and a swaying body. The apparition was clearly attempting to follow a straight course, and 2 of us unslung our carbines and approached close enough to recognize a bloodied Russian army uniform beneath the layers of dust and dirt. His gymnasiorka was hanging beltless from his body. I approached him and seized his upper arm, looking into the parchment-like face of an approximately 28-year-old soldier. The thin face stared back at me, wide-eyed and unblinking. The eyes of the insane, I thought to myself. From the encrusted blood on his neck and torso, I was able to determine that he had received a severe head wound, as grey brain matter protruded from a closely cropped skull. A cloud of flies swarmed about the wound caked with black-red blood, and it was obvious that a bullet or shell fragment had ripped part of his skull away some days previously. He must have been lying unconscious in the undergrowth until shortly before our arrival. 2 of us grasped him by the shoulders and led him with us toward the aid station, attempting to support him as he stumbled forward, unable to regain his balance. Through a haze of pain, I became conscious of a horse-drawn battery that halted alongside us in a cloud of dust, and a number of lancers assisted us in climbing aboard the caissons. They offered us water from field flasks, and the soldier in Russian khaki, wedged tightly between us, began to stammer. Through the croaking of his voice, I could understand "woti," water. Exhausted, we reached the medical station, and from behind a feverish veil, I observed how the wounded who had accompanied me were tended, and the Russian soldier's head was bandaged. I was given a number of tablets, and the medical officer reported that a thermometer revealed a temperature of 39.8 degrees Celsius. I was then given warm tea in a field cup, and a medical orderly led me to a straw bed in a former schoolhouse. I did not awaken before the afternoon of the following day, after having slept 18 hours straight. Feeling fresh and wide awake, I was provided a meal consisting of a healthy portion of bean soup and heavy black bread, which I consumed ravenously. Looking around, I was surprised to see that the area was almost deserted. The wounded occupants of the aid station were no longer present. They had either been evacuated or had been diagnosed as fit enough to be returned to their units, and only a small number of ill soldiers remained at the station, attended by the young medical orderly who had assisted me upon my arrival. He advised me that during the early morning hours, the seriously wounded had been transported and that a medical officer had attempted to awaken me without success. The following morning my fever was gone, and I was directed to return to my company. After a journey on a series of trucks and in pony carts, I managed to locate my gun crew, who, during my absence, had again been sent back into action against enemy units that had temporarily broken through near Kanev. The sight of ragged individuals approaching our positions with upraised arms became commonplace. On the 26th of August, we utilized all available time for reinforcing our positions. The overextended sector assigned to our division offered numerous landing areas for the enemy, and fortunately, our heavy weapons were available to provide blocking and cover fire in the event of an attack. During the night of the 28th of August, we shifted to Khodorov on the Dnieper to reinforce a gun company that occupied a strategically important point on the line. This point commanded the heights of the bank on both sides of the river and was occupied by thinly scattered forces. The village was situated along an unpaved road where two bulkers converged, and isolated primitive dwellings lay scattered along the length of the small valley to the river. From the pack position, our view of the river was obstructed by trees, ragged hedges, and rustic clay cottages with thatched roofs and whitewashed walls. A large, prominent stone building served as a central reference point. Prior to our unexpected and unwelcome presence, it had probably served as the village school. Below a steep embankment less than 100 meters from our position, the river flowed sluggishly to points unknown, and on the eastern edge of the village was a tomato farm. From the edge of the embankment, the wide expanse of the river, which curved its way around small groups of islands, was clearly visible, and the eastern shore was thickly covered with a heavy growth of trees and bushes. A shallow island directly opposite us was covered with thick vegetation, effectively concealing all signs of Soviet presence. Our supporting artillery battery, situated on a commanding terrain feature, was entrenched near a tomato kolkhoz that controlled a splendid view overlooking the enemy-held territory. The locations of enemy troop concentrations could be discerned through the vertical wisps of smoke rising from many cooking fires. Our artillery remained active and engaged in intermittent shelling in attempts to disrupt the enemy supply routes that lay hidden from our view. Otherwise, the front remained quiet. Shortly after our arrival, we sat in front of one of the huts, and I pulled my harmonica from its customary place in an interior pocket of my tunic. As I began playing folk songs, I was quickly surrounded by a motley collection of civilians, who appeared before us like shadows from the surrounding cottages. The melody, unshaven and far from home, brought the audience to life, and they clapped and sang their folk song Stenka Rasin. In their bright scarves, the women and girls nodded to the tune. The old men and boys tapped their feet on the Russian clay to the music played from a German harmonica. After an hour, we received word from the commander of the Panzer Jaeger platoon to spread straw in a former storage facility to use as quarters. Disappointed that we would not be quartered in the scattered rows of huts, we reluctantly obeyed. A large number of us felt as though we had entered a trap, for the building had only one entrance and was located in the centre of the village, which offered no clear field of fire in any direction. At the very least, we would have preferred to bivouac in an open area to which we were accustomed. Our gun remained limbered to the tractor 20 or 30 metres from us beneath a grove of trees, and a sentry was assigned to stand watch near the single door of the barracks. The clear sky brought a cool summer night, and approximately 30 of us settled into the improvised quarters, where we were soon immersed in a deep sleep. Just before dawn, we were startled awake by the sudden detonations of hand grenades near our shelter. A burst from a submachine gun hammered against the wooden rear wall of the storage shelter, and the guard sprang through the door into the darkness of the building. "The Russians are here! The Russians are here!" he screamed. I leaped into my boots, grabbed my equipment and ammunition belt, and scrambled along with Hartmann and several others toward the only exit. True to the discipline of the German Wehrmacht, our first thoughts were to get to the park, and we stumbled toward it through the darkness. I caught a glimpse of a glowing ember arching toward us from the edge of the stream, and immediately recognized the burning fuse of a hand grenade. I instinctively dove behind the tractor, and the grenade detonated harmlessly a second later. The few men who managed to rally in the vicinity of Hartmann's gun at the onset of the surprise attack now opened fire with rifles and machine guns, kneeling behind the tractor or lying prone on the ground. As I pulled 2 grenades from my belt and tossed them in a wide arc over the tractor to the edge of the stream, Hartmann bounced a 3rd grenade farther into the ravine. As we suppressed the enemy fire, the chatter of Russian submachine guns slackened, and we received no more hand grenades from the streambed. In the interim, more men of the platoon had sprinted from the building and attempted to reach our position. From the direction of the wooden bridge, a new firefight raged approximately 100 metres from us. We suddenly caught a glimpse of the platoon leader dashing past us, screaming, "I've been wounded!" and he quickly disappeared into the darkness near the storage shed. Taking advantage of the pause in the firing, we unlimbered the pack and began firing into the heavy undergrowth along the stream from where we could still discern the twinkling muzzle flashes of the Russian weapons. Bullets striking against the shield of our gun were clearly audible, but with several dozen anti-personnel rounds we managed to suppress their fire, and the Russians broke off any further attacks. It had all taken place in less than 10 minutes. Hartmann and I hastened into the storage shed, where the lieutenant was lying with a bullet wound through his thigh. Already being bandaged by a medical orderly, the wound was bleeding profusely, although the orderly reported that no artery had been severed and no broken bone was noticeable. We left the 2 communicators and the lieutenant's driver with him and returned to our platoon. Hartmann assumed command of the platoon and ordered Burkhardt and me to establish contact with the company headquarters in the village. We cautiously stepped onto the bridge and immediately discerned the lifeless form of a Russian lying several metres from us, the silhouette of his body a stark contrast against the pale wood in the bright moonlight. The enemy had apparently broken off their attack and retreated, and within a few minutes we had made our way to the company headquarters located in a farmhouse. The headquarters was filled with wounded, tended by a medical Feldwebel. Here we were told that at the time of the attack on our quarters, the Russians had simultaneously launched an attack against another unit quartered in the east end of the village. We made our report, and to our relief, we were immediately dismissed to return to the more familiar surroundings of our platoon. After returning from the company headquarters, we transferred the pack to a more advantageous position about 50 metres from the warehouse. From this location, we could cover an area extending from the top of the ravine to the bridge, and would be able to take any further attacks under direct fire. We kept the ravine and the slopes to the right and left of us under close observation, but we detected no further enemy movement and received no further fire. There were reports circulating that the Russian attack had been repulsed and that the lieutenant had received a Heimatschuss. We had just begun to feel secure in our new environment when suddenly, in the growing light of dawn, I observed to our left a small group of Russians pulling a heavy MG over a rise behind the schoolhouse. We scrambled to our assigned defensive positions and immediately opened fire on them with armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds, our anti-personnel ammunition having been expended. They dove for cover, leaving several dead and wounded on open ground. We fired into the location where they remained under concealment and into the abandoned schoolhouse to prevent them from establishing a machine gun position. After several shots, we observed several Russians retreating rapidly toward their rear, followed by the rapid hammering of our MG-34. Suddenly, the air directly before us exploded with small arms fire. From a close range, we came under fire from infiltrating Soviets, and the shouts of the Ivans were clearly audible from the cover of the ravine. Through thick bushes, trees, and small gardens of sunflowers, tomatoes, and bean plants, the enemy again worked their way forward to our position, tossing hand grenades through the air that rolled to within 10 paces of our gun before exploding. We frantically pulled the last case of 37mm ammunition from our tractor as the gun loaders shoveled and kicked a pile of expended shell casings away in an effort to clear the gun area. We had only 30 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition remaining, and as I stripped the last clip of rifle ammunition into the magazine of my carbine, a quick check with the others revealed that they had expended theirs as well. Hartmann had only a half magazine of ammunition for his submachine gun remaining. The Russians attempted to push across the road to reach the storage building, and it was clear to all of us that we had to prevent them from reaching their objective at all costs to avoid being isolated from the remainder of the company, which would mean inevitable annihilation or surrender. At approximately 1,000, the last anti-tank round was fired from the smoking barrel of our Pak. In attempts to deny us the use of our gun tractor, the Russians now assaulted the building directly, and soon it had been set ablaze by either tracer fire or Molotov cocktails. Unable to know if there had been enough time for an evacuation of the barracks, we could only hope that the wounded officer had been taken to safety. As we expended the last rounds of ammunition, I removed the bolt from the breech of the Pak and tossed it into the undergrowth before joining Hartmann in crawling through one of the ravines leading toward the west. At times, crawling on our stomachs through the underbrush and then scrambling from cover to cover, we were eventually able to reach an excavated cave cut deep into the clay of the ravine. There we discovered a number of the village inhabitants, peering fearfully toward the sound of the fighting with anxious faces. Obviously, the village had been previously warned of the pending attack, and the villagers had crept into the hole to wait out the battle. Ignoring the presence of the terrified civilians, we scrambled to the crest of the ravine. From this higher observation point, we could see the Russians swarming around the storage shed some 300 meters distant. From behind a tree, I took careful aim and squeezed off several shots with my carbine, and Hartmann suddenly shouted that relief was en route. An infantry company and part of the now dispersed unit that had been positioned next to us had assembled on the western side of the village. Hartmann and I wound our way through the underbrush down to the road, and we observed our company commander careening into the village in his sidecar. Russian artillery rounds could be heard impacting far behind us. Our own heavy weapons took the embankments of the Dnieper under fire to block a Russian retreat, and our attacking companies pushed forward. Hardly 30 minutes had passed when, after searching the area, I was able to slide the bolt back into the breech of our gun, and within several hours the enemy had been thrown back into the river through counterattacks. The survivors who were attempting to reach the safety of the east bank with rafts and boats were taken under fire by our artillery. We had repelled an attack by enemy forces 4 to 5 times stronger than our own, and we began the search for the wounded lieutenant. Despite a sweep of the entire area, we were unable to locate him, finding only a blood-stained officer's boot in front of the burned-out storage building. During the search for the officer, we came upon a Russian soldier chewing sunflower seeds in the garden of a nearby straw and mud cottage. Offering no resistance, he raised his hands high in surrender and approached us cautiously, glancing about fearfully and waving his open hands slightly as he neared our position. After a cursory search, he was taken to regimental headquarters for interrogation. The following morning, the rifle company reported the discovery of an unidentified body where the stream met the Dnieper. We later learned from the company commander that the body was indeed that of the lieutenant, who had been executed by a shot in the back of the neck, probably by a political commissar. There was no trace of two other missing members of one of the rifle platoons, and most likely they were taken over the Dnieper as prisoners. A Russian medical officer, who was later captured after the encirclement at Kiev, reported that the German prisoners captured in this area had been executed prior to the Soviet capitulation of that city. We later heard reports that during the night of the attack, the village schoolteacher and a young communist member, Olga, both of whom on the previous evening had joined us in singing Stenka Rasin, had slipped through the Balka under cover of darkness to swim across the wide river. On reaching the Soviet positions, they had provided detailed information to the Russian troops on the east bank, outlining our positions and strength before leading a Russian battalion unnoticed over the river and into the Balka. Our quarters were situated near a bridge that provided a passage over this ravine into the village. The war in the east had begun to exhibit its brutality. Nevertheless, none of us could foresee or comprehend that the bitterness and rage of the Russians following the invasion of their country would grow more intense with each passing year. Much of the civilian population was in opposition to this retribution, especially on the southern sector of the Eastern Front, where we were relatively well regarded. Many of the Russian prisoners captured early during the campaign had expressed a strong desire to fight alongside us against Stalin and the Soviet government. As time passed, the communist leadership abandoned the call to sacrifice oneself for communism and sought to make a strong appeal to the inherent patriotism of the people. To defend Mother Russia against the invading fascist intruders became the patriotic duty for everyone, with absolutely no exceptions. Thus, the conflict evolved into a war of the Russian people against the German aggressors, instead of a struggle for the survival of the party. Unfortunately, the brutal measures of the Soviets could be compared with the conduct of the German occupiers in the rear areas, far behind the front. Through the excesses that took place against the Russian people, the German soldier became, to the simple Russian, a fighter and supporter for a despised, murderous political institution. Because of this doctrine, established and mandated in faraway Berlin, countless atrocities were in turn committed on soldiers in the front lines, even though we front soldiers were unaware of the murder of thousands of innocent people through the Sonderkommandos of the system, or of the excesses practiced for the pacification of captured areas by our golden pheasants of the National Socialist Party. The commanders of the divisions on the front, as well as many regiment and battalion-level commanders, were at that time veterans and participants of World War I, who conducted and fought the war with the undeniable fairness instilled in the officers' corps of the Kaiser's army. It must be added that during the entire campaign in the East, I never experienced a single incident when Russian soldiers who had surrendered were not correctly handled, or when captured enemy wounded were not medically treated exactly as our own. During the attack on Kharkiv, prisoners were simply sent to the rear unguarded, as every available man was desperately needed at the front. However, I maintain the belief that from the masses of prisoners sent to the rear in this manner, many communists and Russian patriots used the opportunity to slip into the undergrowth and eventually make contact with the ever-growing bands of partisans. The well-organized partisan units would become an increasing menace to our rear areas. As the war continued, the people came to trust and support the partisans to a great extent, and they were able to find shelter and protection everywhere. Throughout the first half of September, we continued to defend our positions on the banks of the Dnieper as the Soviets attempted to regain the West Bank. On the 14th of September, our first units pushed over the river. Following a reconnaissance on the Dnieper island north of Balika, a successful landing was made and the Soviet defences on the heights of the bank were assaulted. Despite strong enemy resistance, large numbers of prisoners were taken. 2 days later, our company followed the foremost units as a reserve and landed on the opposite bank. By exploiting the confusion of enemy forces, we successfully established a deep bridgehead that continued to be built up by more forces being pushed over the river into the breach. The German artillery batteries ceaselessly fired on enemy positions on the opposite bank from Khodorov, and simultaneously a line of fire was laid down to the east of the Dnieper tributary near Balika. By nightfall, the advance units had reached the area of Yashniki. On the 17th of September, the reinforced infantry regiment 438 gained further ground against a weak but heavily resisting enemy near Balika and Reshkishchav, while attempting to make contact with advance elements of another corps along the Yerkovzy road. The attack objective was reached in the late afternoon, following the elimination of pockets of resistance. We continued to press onward, advancing to the vital main route from Kiev to the area of Yerkovzy, thus severing an important Soviet withdrawal route. During the night, we received little rest as we dug into the hard earth to reinforce our line. We sweated and toiled in the damp air until dawn as the constant rumbling of motor vehicles and the clattering of armour drifted towards us from the enemy positions. Throughout the day on the 18th of September, we continued to strengthen our positions, although the enemy line had become quiet, with little movement detected. As dusk approached, we felt secure in the knowledge that the Soviet forces had withdrawn farther to the east, leaving only a rear guard to slow our advance.